All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is the third UHP Network webinar. It is a free one this time, going out to everybody that's available on the network. If you're unfamiliar and you're watching this from somewhere else, you want to go to uhpnetwork.mn.co and you can join us on there. If you're interested in my work, if you're not familiar with who I am, I'm Bill Hartman. I'm the constructor of the Unified Health and Performance Continuum model. And we have a network of professionals scattered all over the world, very large group of people all digging in and learning together. And this is one of the elements of content that we put out every week for the UHP Plus members. And tonight's topic is going to be on rolling, and we're going to show you how we use this to produce the desired movements. And for those of you that don't do manual therapy, you actually do manual therapy. So this is going to be how you're going to learn how to do mobilizations. So real quick, as I stated before, this is a free week of content on UHP Network. So today, free article went up for those on the UHP network. This is webinar will go up this week as well. Just of note, if you're interested in digging in harder and you want to take this a little bit more seriously, we've got a large group of professionals that are working very hard in the UHP Plus side of things. So there's a 3-day free trial of the UHP Plus on the UHP network. So give that a try. It's at no risk to you. Just an FYI, for those of you that have been interested in the intensive 22 looks like it's going to be at the end of October. The UHP Plus members are going to get the first notification when applications are open for the intensive 22. A couple of requirements. You have to have already taken the Model 101 course and the decision making course first. But thankfully, those are free to all who join us on the network. And so then if you take those two, pass with flying colors, you'll be the first notified when we're ready to open up applications. Just an FYI, on next month's webinar, which will not be free, it will only be to UHP Plus members, we're going to be breaking down the golf swing, similar to what we're doing tonight with rolling. So the first, an obvious question is, why would we use rolling? Well, we're going to use rolling because we're going to take advantage of the ground contacts in the gradients to promote an axial shape change. So this is going to be our point of emphasis. We're going to emphasize the axial shape change that's going to be associated with a desired movement. And we're going to start by establishing some basic principles. Number one, first and foremost, there has to be a gradient that exists. And so when we're talking about a gradient, we have to have the access to a change. So one of the easiest ways to look at this would be to look at the thorax, and the thorax is variable in its volume, it's variable in its shape. And so we would have to have sufficient volume and sufficient capacity to change that shape to actually effectively use rolling principles. When I say effectively, this is actually to establish the relative motions that would be associated with normal, comfortable, pain-free movement. Our axis of rotation in rolling is actually going to be identified relative to the long and the perpendicular axes of the axial skeleton. We'll go over those in just a few minutes. Another simple principle, the rolling axis approximates the long axis of the more the rolling axis approximates the long axis of the axial skeleton, the greater the internal rotation that's going to be required to turn with relative movement. We're going to give you a bunch of examples on that as well, so you'll get to see those. In opposition to that, the more the rolling axis approximates the perpendicular axis of the axial skeleton, the greater the external rotation required to turn with relative motion. Once again, we will show you those examples. If I'm rolling from prone, or if I'm rolling from dorsal sacral, which would be the upper back, if I roll over that first, that's going to emphasize an exhalation strategy and internal rotation requiring the application of ER and inhalation to produce a turn. If I'm rolling from supine or from sacral to dorsal, then I'm going to be emphasizing an inhalation strategy. External rotation, I'm going to require the application of internal rotation, exhalation to turn. And so each of these principles, we're going to go through them. You'll pick this up as we go along because I'm going to give you plenty of examples. One of the things that we talk about a lot in regards to shape change and how we actually utilize the energy that we're going to absorb from movement and actually deliver it into the ground is difficult to picture at times because, again, we have to transfer energy through waves. You're a big bag of water, so one of the ways that we're going to be transferring that energy is through different waveforms, but it's really, really hard to see. And what I have here is actually a wavetable, and I'll show you a little bit of video here so you can actually see how this might be shaped. So if you look at the picture underneath this, you're going to see that I'm actually bringing one knee to the chest. And so this initial waveform here is actually the shape and the turn that we're going to see in the axial skeleton as I start to bend my hips. So this is actually going to be an ER representation with a superimposition of internal rotation on it as you bring the knee towards the chest. So we're actually looking above the sacral base up into the lumbar spine as we're looking at this turn. So this would represent that initial position that you might assume if you were going to say roll supine from right to left. If we look at the continuation of the roll, what's going to happen is we're going to actually have a change of the direction of the energy, and we'll see something that looks a little bit more like this. And so you're going to follow it actually in the opposing direction. So this would be, in this case, a more top-down representation. So one of the things that we have to recognize as we're watching these rolls is that rolling is just another form of propulsion. And so the way propulsion is defined within my model is that this is moving forward through space in contact with a medium. And so what we wanted to recognize, whether we're talking about walking, whether we're talking about rolling, whether we're talking about swimming, is that all of these forms of movement through space are propulsion. And so we'll have an early phase where we're primarily associating ourselves with absorbing energy. So this is going to be an external rotation bias with a superimposition of internal rotation. So one of the things that we have to recognize is that the internal and external rotation are superimposed. And so this is where we can actually recognize both. So external rotation is going to represent in the space that we are accessing, and the internal rotation is going to be the degree to which that we are actually turning down and pushing down into the ground, or into, in this case, it would be a medium. To be very general, if we're rolling across the ground, obviously we're going to roll across a firm surface, but if we were swimming, the medium is going to be water. And so again, the resistance is a little bit different, but the rules follow. Once we move from an early propulsive strategy, we're going to move into a middle propulsive representation. And this is where we're going to see external rotation and internal rotation actually superpose. So the difference between superimposition is that we can actually see both. With superposition, we're only going to see one. In middle propulsion, this is where we're actually applying forces straight down into the ground. We are in orthogonal joint relationships, and so only the internal rotation will be recognized in this circumstance. This is high force representations and lots of compressive strategy. So we're going to see a lot of muscle activity to apply force from proximal to distal into the ground. This is going to move us into a late propulsive strategy. Once again, we're going to see the reemergence of the external rotation bias and a reduction of the internal rotation. And this is going to be more of an energy releasing representation, whereas early propulsion, also an ER bias, was energy absorbing. But the takeaway point here is rolling is propulsion. So if you were on webinar 2, we talked quite a bit about the phases of propulsion in regards to the foot. And so this is just a little bit of a refresher on that concept. And so each one of these foot representations represents its requisite phase of propulsion. The thing that I want you to take away from this image, if we look from left to right, so we would have early, middle, and then late, is that what we're looking at is actually shape change. So, traditional viewpoints would say, well, we have joint movement, which I don't think there's any question that we can look at this from a relative movement perspective. But the thing that I want you to take away is that we're really looking at shape changes. The reason being is that when we're looking at rolling, we're going to see, because all forms of propulsion follow the same rules, we're going to see the similarity in the shapes that we're going to be using to move through space. And so this is a nice little representation of a right to left roll. And if you look close enough, you can probably make the associated shape changes that we're actually seeing as we're rolling. So what we're really looking at here is a fractal representation. So what we just increased the scale. So instead of just looking at the foot in isolation and saying, okay, these are the associated shape changes, what we're actually looking at is we're going to see something that's a little bit more systemic. We're going to see this in a much larger scale as we move through the axial skeleton, following the same rules, just like the foot. So this is another representation of how we would see fractals, where we have the entire human. We're going to perform some measure of rotation, but what we'll actually see is we'll actually see these representations show up in the thorax. So we reduce our scale somewhat to a singular iteration of anatomy. We see the same shape change in the thorax of the pelvis, all the way down to each individual vertebra is going to follow suit. So we're going to look at some individual elements associated with rolling. So we're going to go through and identify the orthogonal axes that we would make reference to. We'll review the concept of a gradient so we can actually see that. And then we'll discuss the rolling axes, because we're going to have several representations that are going to work together ultimately to produce some of these activities that we're going to do on the ground. We're going to look at rolling as mobilization. So once again, for those of you that don't lay hands, don't do manual therapies, I got news for you. You got ways that you can actually create some of the same effects that we would normally do with our hands. And then we're going to look at directionality, which does matter, because when we talk about energy transfer, it does matter what direction the energy is going, because if I see a certain representation in isolation, I can actually misidentify what is actually happening from one segment to the next if I don't know which one is moving first. And we'll clarify that a little bit too. Then we'll go through some examples at the end of the talk. So these are the orthogonal axes. So orthogonal just means organized at 90 degrees. So we actually have a singular long axis. And this is actually the axis, if we go back into embryology, this is the axis upon which everything is designed. In fact, the reason that we call the axial skeleton is because it's named after this axis. The point being here is that this is a rotational axis that you can't actually rotate around. In fact, we have to be just off of this to actually induce any rotation. So if we were perfectly aligned on this axis, there would be no rolling take place. The perpendicular axis, obviously, relative to the long axis, is going to be a 90 degrees. Once again, this is an axis where no rotation and actually no movement would exist. We would just rotate around this axis. But if we look at something that would be close, so we always say that, well, if standing rotation in this circumstance would be on the long axis. It's not actually on the long axis, because what we have to do is we have to move off the axis. But the thing I want you to recognize about this is that we have differences in the application of internal rotation towards and away from the ground. And so what we have, because we're so close to the long axis of the axial skeleton, this is a strong representation of internal rotation. So internal rotation is straight down into the ground. And so if you look at the different ways that you turn, the down arrow is going to represent a proximal to distal internal rotation. So we're actually driving this down into the ground. So the down force on the green arrow side is actually greater than it is on the other side. We're actually acquiring internal rotation. So we're actually absorbing energy from the ground. If we look at the yellow arrow side, so this is just an initial introduction into this concept of directionality, because as we turn and we go through these different phases of propulsion, we have to actually change the direction that we're applying and transferring energy. So again, just to give you the idea that, okay, if we were directly on this perpendicular axis, we're not going to be able to produce any rotation. So we have to be just slightly off in either direction. Once again, we have proximal to distal and distal to proximal relationships. Both ER and IR are now represented by producing this rotation. If we were straight on the axis, all we would be able to see would be the orientations. So let's review the concept of a gradient. So a gradient gives us the opportunity to change. And so if we were talking about the concentration of a solute in water, the solute would move relative to, it would move downhill in regards to a high concentration gradient to a low concentration gradient. In this respect, we're talking about the volumes and pressures that would be associated with breathing or movement. And so as long as we have the ability to produce a change, we'll be able to produce a turn, which will allow us to use rolling effectively as a strategy to produce movement that someone may not be able to do because of the orientation of gravity. In a typical vertical upright stance, we can actually alter the direction of gravity favorably that will allow us to manage internal forces, external forces, and produce shape changes that we wouldn't normally be able to do in an upright stance. Now we're going to look at the rotational axes. And so as we mentioned before, if we were directly on the long axis of the axial skeleton or the perpendicular axis, we really wouldn't be able to produce any rotation. And so then what we're going to start to look at is we're going to start to look at some of the helical orientations of the axial skeleton. And we can use our foundational representation of our helical axis. So this is where we start talking about archetypes. And so if you go back to webinar number 1, we established how these archetypes are actually constructed, why we benefit from our helical orientation. So the white X's in this circumstance actually represent the helical axes of the thorax and the pelvis in different orientations relative to a rolling axis that's actually going to start to combine the axes of the thorax and the pelvis as one. And so these will be representative of how, if we turn far enough into a position, these axes are going to actually combine into a much larger axis, and then they're going to re-separate. And so as they are separate, we would have access to greater relative motion. As they're combined, we would then lose some measure of relative motions. And this would be at the end phases of each phase of propulsion. So if we were at the very beginning of early, it would be the least amount of relative motion we would have access to in early propulsion. If we were at the very end of late propulsion, once again, we would be in the least representation of relative motion, with ER being predominant. If we were in dead center middle, this would be in line with our long axis of the axial skeleton. So once again, we would never have access to that motion. So we mentioned the foot before, and I just wanted to throw up a foot representation of these things, just so you get a general idea of what we're talking about. So if we were off the long axis and off the perpendicular axis to some degree, we're going to see a more oblique orientation in regard to the rolling axes. If we bring everything together and we're closer to that long axis, this is where we're going to see this really strong representation of internal rotation that has to be maintained to produce a turn. And then if we're looking at 2 feet behaving separately, it would be much like stacking the thorax on top of the pelvis. However, if we were to rotate far enough through those feet, these 2 axes would join and would look a lot like the 2 feet that are on the left. So this gives us a little bit of a representation of initiating a roll from the ground. We can see that if we initiate with the upper extremity here, the rolling axis is initially going to be the helical axis of the thorax. So this would be where we would represent our narrow or wide ISAs. They would be rolling on this axis. If they were continue to roll through that axis, this is where we're going to start to combine the thorax and the pelvis anatomical iterations into a singular representation. And this is where we're going to see it combine into the long axis, or the longer axis is what I should say, of the axial skeleton for rolling, that we'll see that extends from one shoulder to the opposite hip. Now let's discuss rolling as a mobilization. So this is going to be important to understand because again, if you don't do manual therapies, you can still have great success using the ground contact as long as you understand where the contacts need to be, how you're going to initiate these activities, and what the representations of movement are going to be. So I'm going to bring back the foot a little bit, and I threw some arrows on here so you can get a general idea of the interaction of external rotations and internal rotations in each representation of propulsion. And so this is our ER biased foot. This is an early representation of propulsion through the foot. It's primarily going to be associated with external rotation. So if we were to divide the foot into four segments, rear foot, a midfoot, the forefoot, and the toes, this is what we would see. So the orange arrows are going to represent external rotation. The green arrow is going to represent the internal rotation. And this is the initial point where the foot is making contact with the ground. So this will be just as the first metatarsal head is making contact. And then what you're going to see is you're going to see an increasing representation of internal rotation accumulate through the foot. So we'd see it through the rest of the foot, then we would see the tibia, and then we would see it extend all the way up into the pelvis. The walk away point here is that we do have these differentials that are going to be represented through the iterative segments of the anatomy. As we move towards middle, we're going to see a flip-flop of the strategy. So this is where we're going to accumulate the greatest representation of internal rotation at each segment. Now, this doesn't turn like a brick would turn if you were turning it over. This is a segmental rotation. So if you took yourself from arrow to arrow to arrow, that would be more like the representation. And so we can go back to our wave table as a representation of how this energy is going to pass through the foot and then produce these representations. Finally, what we're going to see is we're going to see the representation of late propulsion. So again, this is the reemergence of the external rotation. And you can see that where the internal rotation was moving distal to proximal in the early representation, the distal to proximal representation here is going to be the external rotation. So this is one of the things that differentiates the late propulsive representation from the early representation is the direction of internal rotation and then the direction of external rotation. So in this case, IR is still going into the ground, but ER is moving distal to proximal. This is important because when we start talking about mobilizing a specific segment, and if we freeze our wave table, we can actually see how this differential is going to look. Everything in this picture is actually turning in the same direction. They're just turning at different rates. So even though the segments that appear to not be moving, they would actually be moving in the same direction, but at a slower rate. So this allows us to represent a top-down versus bottom-up strategy. So again, energy absorption, moving from bottom up, energy delivery or release would be more top-down. So to give you an idea of how these axes would look, I broke out, Alfred, my skeleton, and I'm going to apply a little bit of pressure on video here so you can actually see how this would move. So this is an application of energy along the long axis. So this is next to the long axis of the spine, and what it would do is it would produce again, because we're close to this long axis, we're going to produce a lot of external rotation, which means we need to maintain a lot of internal rotation for relative motions. So this is almost a pure turn, which would be representative of the external rotation. If we look at it going straight through the long axis, this is where we're going to see our purest form of IR, where there's essentially no rotation whatsoever. And so by tradition, most folks would call this spinal extension for consistency and coherence within a representative model that relies on the internal and external rotations. This is going to be a pure internal rotation. So there's going to be no rotation in this circumstance. Now, if we talk about the segmental rotations, on the left, you can see that I have two spinal segments and a rib, and this is going to allow us to recognize the bottom-up representation. So this would be more of what we would see in an early propulsive representation, where we're going to have an external rotation through the rib on this side is going to produce an external rotation moment in the lower segment first, and then we'll have a relative internal rotation relative to that lower segment. But what we're going to expect is that this energy is going to be propagating from the bottom up through the spine. So at each segment, as each segment and rib turns, we're going to see the next segment follow. But at this point in time, it appears that they are turning in opposition. And so this is where we're going to say that, well, this is going to be our axis of mobilization if we were going to be particular about a specific segment. If we look at the opposing representation, which is actually our top down, so I snapped the rib off of the spine so you can actually see how the joints would interplay to produce this. So this is going to be a top down. It's going to be more representative of an exhalation strategy because we got more internal rotation associated with this. But now we're going to see the top segment move first. And so once again, we will see the ER to IR representation occur in the most superior segment, and then this would be moving downward through the next segment. So if I was in the clinic and I was going to bias the sacrum towards a counternutated yielding action of the connective tissues, I would be setting up a muscle energy technique that would be similar to this. And so I'm just showing you where the focal strategy would be. And so as we bend the hip upward, we're going to create a bottom up representation that's going to go through the sacrum. So this is going to be an ER representation of the sacrum and create the delay strategy at in this case, the right sacral base. But we've got a top down IR rotation that's going to interfere. And what this does, it allows us to place emphasis on a very specific area. So once again, if I'm trying to influence the sacrum more directly, this would be a position that I would use. If I was trying to do the opposing representation under this circumstance, what I'm using here is I'm using a top-down IR strategy. So this would be more representative of a nutated representation at the right sacral base. And once again, I'm going to use a bottom-up strategy through the hips to make sure that this does not propagate further. Therefore, I am, again, placing emphasis on the sacral base. For those of you familiar with spinal manipulations, it's the same strategy that we were just talking about in regard to the muscle energy technique, but in this case, we're going to use a high velocity, low amplitude thrust. And again, what this is going to do is it's going to just amplify the amount of energy that's being transferred, and it's going to provide us actually greater depth. So this is going to be more effective at the skeletal level. If we look at a roll under this circumstance, so I threw the foot down here because it gives us a sort of like a directionality, if you will, as to if this was going through the foot, what it would look like. And so this is going to be a bottom-up representation, at least initially, where we're going to see the sacrum counternutate. We're going to have an ER representation that's going to be moving through the spine and through the pelvis with an internal rotation that is superimposed from distal to proximal in this case, but it would be bottom up in the axial skeleton. So we can start to mobilize individual segments because I've essentially prevented the rotation from propagating up through the thorax. So I have a top down interfering with the bottom up representation. So where those two would meet would be this point of mobilization. I can do a similar activity. In this case, it's prone, and we can actually see a little bit more of this externally rotated representation if we're using this lower extremity lead. And in this case, we're going to be driving a little bit more of the early strategy as the roll progresses. So if we initiate this with just the leg, what we're actually going to see is we're going to see the top down element, and this is actually changing its direction as we continue to elevate, where you'll see the top down strategy and the green arrow meet the red arrow under that circumstance. For those of you familiar with arm bars, depending on the type of grip that we would use on the kettlebell, we're actually going to create an intentional interference. So in this case, because of the roll that we're using, because of the positions that we're using, we actually have a bottom-up internal rotation, and the bottom-up kettlebell actually maintains an early representation in the upper portion of the thorax, which is going to interfere with the progressive internal rotation. So we have an E-yard representation that's going to interfere with the I-yard representation. So this actually allows us to mobilize the rib cage very specifically by maintaining the appropriate grip on this, because again, we have an increase in external rotation and a superimposition of IR in the upper thorax, whereas we're doing a top-down representation in the lower aspect of the axial skeleton. So now we're gonna clarify this point of directionality, and I've got a couple of representations here. So if we go back to the foot representation for a second, where we had both shoulders on the ground, what we would actually be doing is we'd actually be expanding this left posterior aspect of the upper thorax. So this would be a dorsal rostral expansion to initiate the roll. But as we lift up, this is where we have to have the gradient, because what's going to happen under this circumstance is we're going to start to increase the concentric orientation of this dorsal rostral area on the posterior aspect of the axial skeleton. And as we reach forward, we have to be able to expand anteriorly. Universal principle: the universe moves in the direction of expansion. We are part of the universe. We're going to follow that same simple rule. So we start to increase the compression in this position, and this is where we're going to start to transfer the volume anteriorly. On the opposing side, for us to complete this roll, the upper back, the dorsal rostral area on that side is actually expanding, and we're getting an anterior compression at the same time. So as we flip-flop this strategy, this is what actually allows us to move forward through space. We can also create the upper extremity lead from a prone position, and it's going to follow the exact same rule. So as I elevate just the arm from the ground, the anterior aspect of this axial skeleton was actually expanded, and we were compressed posteriorly. But as we continue to roll, what we're going to see is we're going to see a compression on the anterior aspect of the thorax, an expansion on the posterior aspect of the thorax on the elevated side. Once again, we're going to see the reverse on the other side. So we're going to see an expansion on the anterior aspect and a compressive strategy. So there's going to be more IR represented on the downside of the roll. If we were to look at lower extremities, I caught this roll at about the same time. So these are the transitions where we're actually changing strategy. So initially, if we were to bring this knee up past the hip, when we would be aiming towards the nose, this would initially be our superimposition of IR on ER. As we start to complete the roll, this actually has to change direction. So now this is actually going to move into a top-down strategy, where we're actually going to produce more IR proximally and start to push that distally. And that's what allows us to sort of push ourselves over to the other side, which means that I have compression posteriorly now. I'm starting to develop the expansion anteriorly. I have the opposing strategy on the other side. If I go from prone to supine, we are now at a transition where, if we were to look at the left sacral base, left lumbar, we would be in an E-ard position, but we're about to, we would have the compression anteriorly. This is going to continue to expand on this side, which will allow the roll, and then we're going to get the opposing strategy on the other side. So what we're going to see is we're going to see the top-down strategy here, bottom-up strategy on the left side, so we can roll over to the right. Point being is that if we can't flip-flop these strategies, we can't truly roll. We can't truly access the relative motions. We might be able to go from prone to supine, but we're certainly not going to be using a relative motion strategy. In many cases, what folks will do is they're going to hit those big X's that we saw when we were talking about the rolling axis. And so then they're going to roll through the peripheral joints. They're not going to roll through the axial skeleton, which is going to limit our shape change, our ability to turn, and our ability to actually access relative motion in the extremities versus orientations in regards to our range of motion measurements. So let's look at some example variations here. We talk a lot about side lying, especially right side lying initially. So we have internal forces that we have to manage. There's a leftward bias to those forces, which creates a lot of the strategies that we see. It also establishes why there's certain biases as far as the sequences of movement that we would use to reverse engineer some of these limitations in motion. But right side lying actually gives a gravitational advantage. So instead of working against the vertical on the long axis, we take our long axis, we lay it down, and now we have gravity that's working on the perpendicular. But in this case, we're reducing the internal forces that we have to manage by laying on the right side. So the difference between these two rolling patterns, one is going to be more externally rotated bias, which will be the roll on the left. The other is going to have more internal rotation because, once again, we're rolling so close to the long axis. One of the advantages to side lying is we get an immediate anterior posterior expansion benefit. And so this is actually in the literature. It'll be a study, I believe it's Takashima is the lead author. As we lay on our side, all of your internal organs are going to fall towards the ground. So this is right side lying. So your internal organs fall to the ground and they spread out across the ground, which actually gives us a pressure towards anterior, posterior. And this immediately gives us a tremendous advantage and allows us to establish a gradient, which is why we'll tend to spend a lot of time, at least initially, if we're going to use rolling behaviors as a strategy in right side lying. As we establish rolls, now if we do have this anterior posterior expansion, we do have an established gradient, we can start to move through a very short arc, which will allow us to establish the differentials in pressures that we were talking about before, where we had internal rotation superimposed on external rotation. So if we were to look at the downside in this circumstance, we would have an external rotation bias or a counter-nutated bias in this circumstance, where we would be superimposed the internal rotation that would actually be coming from knee towards the pelvis in this circumstance. We would obviously have the opposing strategy on the top side. Typically, in most circumstances, in regards to the archetype, this is going to be beneficial in most circumstances for both archetypes. If we were to look at this and we continue to move the superior aspect of the axial skeleton now, which would be the left side in this case, and we start to slide that forward, we're going to see the two separate axes, the one in the thorax, the one in the pelvis, start to meet up, and then we're going to move towards the end range of this propulsion. So on the bottom side, we're going to be at the earliest representation of early propulsion, where we've superimposed the internal rotation. On the top side, we're going to be in the latest representation of late propulsion, as the space between the spine and the ilium, and the space between the spine and the scapula are closed. And then once again, this is a good representation of the gradient, where we can see that the thorax axis is more late on the left as representation. We're a little bit more early on the left now as we've initiated the opposing direction of the roll. But what's going to happen is, as this roll continues, the thorax will eventually meet up, and now we're on the same axes, as we're going to reach the earliest representation of early on the left side, latest representation on the downside. Now, there's a lot of rolling videos out there, and we need to distinguish between rolls that create orientations and rolls that are actually going to promote relative motions. And so this is, we're going to make reference to what we call a dorsal sacral roll, and you'll see why here in a moment. And I'm going to show you a representation of what is not a dorsal sacral roll. And you can call this a number of different things if you want. But this is where the knees are tucked up. We have rectus abdominis pulling the sternum towards the pelvis. What we've actually done here is we've actually created a posterior orientation of the pelvis. We've magnified a rectus abdominis strategy, which actually compresses the thorax. So under this circumstance, if we were to use this representation of a roll on the left, we would not be recovering relative motions. What you actually may find is that you get a tremendous amount amount of external rotation back after you do this activity. However, it will not be relative motion external rotation. It will actually be an orientation away from midline to capture those external rotation measures. Now, if we go back to the dorsal sacral roll, you'll see immediately that there's, whoops, let me back up a little bit. You'll see the difference in the setup immediately. So we've got the hands behind the legs, because what we're actually going to do here is we're going to use the legs as the driver of the roll versus trying to increase the muscle activity throughout the axial skeleton. Because what we're actually trying to do is we're trying to create a sequential behavior of the musculature through the axial skeleton, so we can actually move through the phases of propulsion. And so I'll just let this run a little bit, and we'll turn this sideways, and you'll see him initiate the roll using a kick of the legs. And what we're actually doing in this circumstance is we're moving the axial skeleton symmetrically through the phases of propulsion. And so as he rocks back, we've got the inhalation bias. As he rocks back forward, we've got the exhalation bias. So we're actually flip-flopping the early to late strategies as we perform this roll back and forth. So made a couple of videos to show you a little bit of the difference regarding the way that the movement is expressed as it goes through the axial skeleton. So in the first roll, we actually had a fixed compressed representation of a curve that was producing the roll. When we're doing the dorsal sacral roll, because of the way it's set up, because we're using the legs as a driver and we're allowing relative motion to exist through the axial skeleton, we're actually getting this kind of a shape change as we work through the roll. And once again, this is actually going to give us the opportunity to access relative motions. If we were to break this down and use our foot comparison, because I always think the foot's an easy way to see these phases of propulsion. So this is an early representation of propulsion. So if we were to equate the lower extremities as the tibia in this circumstance, and we have essentially landed on the heel, we're about ready to put this first metatarsal head down, which in this case is going to be represented as the scapula. Now we've got a big giant foot that we've got rolling across the ground. So we can kind of see that this is a representation of early propulsion. As we bring the tibia forward over the foot, we're going to see the stronger representation of internal rotation. So we can actually see the shape change in the thorax as we perform the roll. And so once again, we become very orthogonal. There's not a lot of rotation here, not a lot of movement. But what we have done is we've stored energy from the front half of the roll. So this is Isaac Newton's third law at work here. So we're going to have a conservation of momentum that's going to kick us back. And now we're in this late representation through the entire axial skeleton. So again, to sound like a broken record, this is going to allow us to access the relative motions. If we were to look at the foot in real time, this is what we'd be looking at. And this would be a bilateral symmetrical representation of the foot going into late propulsion, driving through late on both feet. Now, when we talk about axes, there's a little bit of confusion about how these rolling axes work. What I'm going to show you is an early representation of a shoulder roll, and we're actually rolling right along the long axis of the spine. So this roll is very biased towards the early representation of propulsion. And to give you an idea of how this would look in standing, I threw in the lower extremities that we looked at before, so you can see some directionality that would be associated with the push down. And this is, I hate saying this. I actually don't hate saying this because I love this kid, but this is about as perfect a early bias shoulder roll that you're ever going to see. But this is going to occur on the long axis, which produces a tremendous amount of external rotation. So holding this position as you perform the roll takes a great deal of control of internal rotation. And he rolls right over that. That is really good. He actually wore the perfect shirt that day because he's got that nice little stripe down the middle. This is another view of the same roll where you can see he just rolls straight down the long axis. But to hold that position demands that you are able to superimpose the internal rotation on the external rotation. Okay, to show the opposing strategy, right? So as we remember the principle that we used early on as that in the early slide is we're going to be using an exhalation bias as we perform a dorsal to sacral roll. So if we were looking at the dorsal sacral roll, this is why we would see the difference in inhalation versus exhalation. And we're going to see the same thing here. Once again, we're rolling right along the long axis of the axial skeleton. So this is still going to require a tremendous amount of internal rotation to execute and then finish. And again, that's a beautiful finish, indicating that he can hold a tremendous amount of this internal rotation. And again, just to show you the side view so you can see the finish. So if you were playing along and I'm making any degree of sense, we can start to use these roles as diagnoses. So for instance, as I show, this is Sebastian, by the way, as I show Sebastian performing the role, and you can see how he executes and how he finishes, that would be indicative of somebody that probably has a great deal of effective relative motion because he's actually able to superimpose a tremendous amount of external rotation, or I'm sorry, a tremendous amount of internal rotation on the external rotation. Now, this is why you keep outtakes, and this is why you challenge people every once in a while to do something that you know that they can't do because you get a great outcome. So when you see Sebastian rolling directly off of this long axis, holding on to the internal rotation, it would stand to reason that if there was a significant deviation away from midline, you would have somebody that could not superimpose internal rotation. So what I did with Eric works for me at IFAST PT. And Eric's a pretty wide kid, and he's got a decent amount of compression. He carries a little bit of muscle mass around. And so I put him in a situation where I made him magnify the internal rotation on this forward roll. So we got an exhalation bias to begin with. I'm going to add more internal rotation that I know he doesn't have access to. And this is basically what we get as a representation. So, and you can see him roll way off axes here. And so what he's doing is he's just following the only axis that he has available, which is external rotation. So this is a great indicator. If you work with groups or you work with a bunch of athletes or you work with a bunch of young kids, you don't table test young kids. You have them roll around on the ground and you see how they do things. And so this gives us a tremendous opportunity to assess many different people that typically we might not be able to assess. All right, now we're going to show how we're going to link some of these axes together with these different variations of rolls. And you've probably seen some variation of these somewhere, but I'm going to try to catch these a little bit as we go through so you can actually see how we'll start to initiate on like a thoracic axis, and then we'll see how we pick up the entire axial axis here. It just takes a second for us to get there. And so this is going to be a lower extremity initiation. We'll roll back. We'll do it again. So as we initiate, let's see if I can catch it. I can't get it to stop. Okay. So as we initiate the lower extremity roll, what we're going to see is we're going to see the top-down representation. To elevate the leg off the ground, remember we need the compression to come from the ground up so we can expand on the top side and initiate the roll over so we can actually move through the entire propulsive phase to get to supine. So if we complete this roll from prone to supine, we have actually gone through an entire phase of propulsion. We're going to see the same thing as we initiate with the upper extremity. We start with what would be an internal rotation bias, top-down representation. We're going to move into a superimposition of internal rotation on external rotation to complete the roll over to supine. once again, we're going to start in supine this time. We'll again look at upper and lower extremity. And I think I neglected to mention that if we start on in a supine position, the external rotation bias is increased in magnitude. So again, if we have a bias towards external rotation, we have to superimpose more internal rotation to actually complete the role effectively. So that's why you would choose the prone versus supine. To emphasize thorax, you would initiate with the upper extremity. To emphasize lower extremity, you would initiate with lower extremity. And so this will be our supine to prone representation. And so again, we're going to initiate, I believe this is the lower extremity. So we're seeing external rotation right here, superimpose IR, and now we're changing direction where this becomes a top down. And as he rolls over, as you see the thorax and the pelvis connect, this is where we're going to see this long axis appear. So what we have is the thoracic axis and the pelvic axis joining into one. And these represent the most extreme representations of the two ends of propulsion. This will be the upper extremity initiation. We're going to see the same thing. So he's going to initiate with the reach. We'll have IR superimposed on ER as he initiates. We'll see the change in volumes and pressure. So we have a posterior compression to the anterior volume to get him to roll from supine to prone. The point of all this is that all of your motion is going to be helical, every bit of it. And so that, especially when we're talking about access to relative motions, the helical axes become very, very important because we have to be able to distinguish between the thorax and the pelvis. In many cases, we're going to have people that are using orientations. So these orientations are where we start to see the lesser representation of relative motion. So these are the extreme ends and the dead center middle of propulsion, where we would see the extreme ERs on both ends, less relative motion. The IR with the superposition of ER and IR, where we're going to see a lot less relative motion. But most of the activities that we do can be broken down. We have roles that will support just about any activity that you can think of. When we think about athletic movements, when we think about into the cut, you can actually start to see some of the shapes and positions that we're actually using in rolling demonstrated here. So if we're working on top speed mechanics, obviously we're going to use a roll that occurs along the long axis, whereas if we're working on changes of direction where we need the stronger representation of ER, we're going to start to move away from midline under these circumstances. And so this wraps up the talk. And so I'm going to stop the share here, and we're going to go over to the studio here. And if anybody's in the chat and has a question, feel free to ask if you have anything that you wanted to go through. I can. Mm-hmm. Oh, there it is. I got it. Okay. Yeah. So it is on. Yes. I'm talking to Chris, by the way. I'm not crazy. We had to turn the chat on so those of you that are actually on the live call can ask questions if you have any. Well, that's wonderful. I am not surprised. He is a question asker. I don't see it. Is it supposed to come up? I do see it. Yep, the test works. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. Manuel, go ahead. I can see it now. So you so the question is, yeah, the question is does the surface that you're rolling on impact the ability to perform these activities? And actually it does. So if you think about um, the the um, the dampening that would be associated with trying to jump off of an exercise mat. So if I put you on a like a 3-inch RX pad and you try to push into the ground, there's going to be a dampening effect that would be associated with the softer surfaces. If our goal is to create the effective shape change, we need the stiffness of the ground. It doesn't mean that you can't use a softer surface, because I'm sure there's going to be people that are a little bit too sensitive, perhaps, to roll across the ground. But ultimately, to maximize the effects that we're talking about, the firmer surface is going to be the better choice. Just like if you were to try to run across the ground as fast as you could, you wouldn't want to run across loose sand. You would want to run across a firmer surface. Okay. We appear to have trouble with the chat on the live stream, so apologies for that. Okay. 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 So we're going to wrap up the webinar for tonight. This will be posted up in the free area. So if you're not a member of the UHP network, please go there and do so. It's uhpnetwork.mn.co to get yourself applied and accepted. And if you have any questions about this webinar, please go to the network and ask those questions there, and we'll be happy to answer those. Thanks for being here.